Do you know what someone on their deathbed might tell you? In a nursing home, I heard confessions that will forever change the way you look at life. From small betrayals to horrifying crimes, these true stories will leave you in shock. Keep watching to find out what happened when I faced unimaginable secrets. I am a nurse who works with the elderly, and I have heard shocking confessions from some of my patients. Although some people think working in this field is difficult, I find it's not as bad as some imagine. Yes, some elderly people can be difficult to deal with at times, and like any other job, there are frustrating moments, but most of them are kind individuals. All they need is a little empathy and patience to connect with them. That's why I love this job and wouldn't give it up if I could. The only thing I don't like is the confessions I sometimes hear from certain patients. They say that people feel their end approaching, and after years of working in this field, I've come to believe that some of them have no family or friends to share their secrets with, so they unburden themselves to us nurses. Most of the time, the confessions are simple and harmless. For example, Gregory confessed that he cheated on his wife in his 30s, or Larry who was into BDSM, or Lisa who stole from her company for a while. Things you might not necessarily expect, but they don't surprise you when you hear them. But at other times, the confessions are unsettling. Like Jenkins, who admitted he got into a fight at a bar and ran away, and to this day, he's still unsure if the other person survived. Or Sasha, who had an abortion without telling her boyfriend she was pregnant. Or Sarah, who ran away from her family in the middle of the night to start a new life, and seeing missing person posters ate her up inside. These are the things that really bother me, but at least I can understand where they're coming from and empathize with them, even if I don't agree with their actions. But then there are the monsters. Those who have committed truly horrific acts, and their confessions keep me awake at night. Like Julia, the sweet old lady I met, who confessed that she drove her husband to suicide to collect his life insurance. Or Freddie, who helped burn down an entire village during the Vietnam War and enjoyed watching the flames and hearing the screams of the dying. Or Sally, who abused her child so badly it caused numerous developmental issues. Of course, I wasn't present for all these confessions. We nurses tend to share these stories with each other, no matter how horrifying. You can judge us if you want, but we didn't ask for these burdens to be placed on us, and we'll seek comfort wherever we can find it. Most of the time, the conversations are innocent, like, "You won't believe what Gus used to do when he was young." But at other times, there are tears and silent screams in the break room, and cold faces and heavy atmospheres where there's no room for joy. That's life in this field. Most of us have learned to live with it, and those who couldn't have left. I'm part of the first group, and I don't think last night will change my mind. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. You need some context to understand what happened. It all started with Parker. He's a bitter old man, and there's no sugarcoating it. He's difficult, full of anger and hatred for everyone and everything. He's the type who won't be happy until he's completely ruined your day. He's been here since before I was hired, so the other nurses warned me about him from day one. They told me, "God help you if you have to deal with him. He can ruin your whole week just by opening his mouth." I didn't take them seriously at first. I thought he couldn't possibly be that bad. But I was wrong. Just not in the way you'd expect. He wasn't physically violent like some other elderly patients, and he didn't throw feces or urine-filled diapers at us. Instead, he threw words, and he knew how to make them cut deep. Our first interaction happened when I had to check on him and make sure he'd taken his medication. It was a pleasant evening, and I found the old man Parker in his room, lounging in his chair facing the window, his back to the door. He didn't even bother to look at me when I entered. "Good evening, Mr. Parker," I greeted him. "Fresh meat," he replied rudely. I tried to be polite and said, "My name is Jessica." But he cut me off. "You won't last a month, so I won't bother learning your name. Why are you here, Fresh Meat?" I told him why, and he pointed to the empty pill bottle on the table beside him, then went back to staring out the window at the sunset without another word. So I left. That's how the first 3 weeks went. I'd go to his room for this or that, he'd throw some insulting comment my way, and I tried to endure it. It was clear he didn't want anyone around, especially me. But I've never been one to back down, and I wasn't about to let some old man with a penchant for destroying people's happiness get the better of me. In the 4th week, as I passed by his room to change his bedsheets, he asked me, "Still here? Oh my God, you're as dumb as you are pretty." He was in his chair again, where he spent most of his evenings and nights. But during the day, he'd go out to the common area to terrorize anyone he came across. However, as night approached, he'd retreat to his room and stare out the window until he fell asleep in the chair. I ignored his comment and approached the bed to change the sheets. "Did you swallow your tongue? Forget how words work," he continued to taunt me. I pulled off the old sheet and tossed it on the floor, even though it wasn't very dirty. That wouldn't be a huge surprise, honestly. The only thing that surprises me is that you learned to talk in the first place. Now, I don't recommend what I did or how I reacted in that moment. I should have just given up and left, but I didn't. After 2 weeks of daily abuse, I snapped. I threw the fresh sheets onto the bed haphazardly and stormed over to his chair. "Listen here, you wrinkled bag," I exploded at him. "I don't know what your problem is, but I don't need this kind of treatment in my life. I'm not surprised your family left you in a place like this. If I were them, I'd have dumped you in a nursing home at the first opportunity too." I hurled insult after insult, trying to draw out the worst in me, expecting Parker to explode and retaliate. But instead, he stood there and listened to everything, and with every foul word I spat out, the corners of his lips turned up slightly into a satisfied smile. I only stopped when I ran out of breath, and he waited a moment to make sure I was done. "What did you say your name was again?" he asked. "Jessica," I replied. "Jessica," he repeated, letting each syllable roll off his tongue. "I'll tell you something, I like you." And that was that. He went back to staring out the window, and I was able to finish my work in peace. I felt guilty about the outburst for a while, worried he'd retaliate in some way and get me fired. But Parker didn't tell anyone. It was our little secret. After that, he'd smile when he saw me. He still made his comments, but they were different, more playful, and they weren't meant to insult or drive me away, just to joke around. And I could handle them without breaking down in tears afterward. So, I considered it a win. After a while, I started joking back. He'd throw his insult of the day, and I'd throw mine. We'd laugh and move on. What I'm trying to say is that we developed a strange kind of bond, and we started enjoying our time together. We didn't talk about anything else. I didn't know anything about him, and he didn't know anything about me. But in my mind, that only added to the charm of the relationship. Life went on, and before I knew it, I'd been working here for years. Rumors about Parker circulated. Everyone had their theories and beliefs, but I couldn't confirm or deny any of them. The man was still as much of a mystery to me as he was on day one. Then, about a month ago, things started to change. He made fewer comments, spent more time in his room, isolated from everyone. Parker had always been very self-reliant for someone his age, but he started needing help with things. I could see it was eating him up inside. I didn't mind, that's what I was paid to do, but the man had pride. He refused to see a doctor and get treatment, so we all expected him to die soon. And that possibility made most people in the nursing home happy, but it terrified me. One evening, before I left for home, I checked on him. Parker was in his usual spot in the chair, the curtains open and the window wide open. The sun had already set, leaving the horizon painted in red as night crept in. He didn't notice me until I stopped beside him. "Hello, Jessica," he greeted me in a low voice. I was about to say, "Hello, old man," but the tone of his voice and the way he said my name made me stop. For the first time in the years I'd known him, he seemed serious. I felt a pang of fear in my stomach. "Is everything okay, Mr. Parker?" I asked. The corners of his lips turned up into a smile, and a dry laugh escaped his throat, but he left my question hanging in the air for a moment. "You heading home tonight?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Can you stay a little longer?" "Of course." I knew what this meant. Parker felt his time was near, and he wanted someone by his side. I tried to take his hand, but he slapped it away. So we stood there in awkward silence, watching the night settle outside the window. "You're the closest thing I have to a friend, Jessica," he said suddenly. "The closest thing I have to family." He laughed again, but it sounded sad. "Oh God, I'm pathetic." I placed my hand on his shoulder, and this time he didn't push it away. I wasn't sure what to say. Parker wasn't the type for emotional speeches, so in the end, I just said it plainly. "In my opinion, that's your fault for being such an angry old man. You could have had plenty of friends here. Do you have any plans tonight?" he asked. And I shook my head. "Then can I answer your question with a story?" "Of course." He shifted in his chair, taking his time as he searched for the right words. I'd seen this before with others. They think they're ready to reveal themselves, until the time comes to do it. With a sigh, he gave in and started talking. Parker was born in a small town in the 1940s, right after World War II. He had an older brother and a father, but he doesn't remember either of them. The older brother died of some illness as a child, and the father was drafted and died in the war while Parker was still a baby. That left his mother alone to raise him, but they weren't the only ones suffering in town. Life was harsh back then, especially in small, isolated communities like theirs. But Parker said he had a decent childhood. "My mother did what she could, worked herself to the bone, and went to bed hungry most nights to make sure I didn't." He paused for a moment and looked directly at me. I knew talking about the past was painful for him, but he looked away after a long moment and went back to staring out into the dark world outside, continuing his story. Despite his mother's efforts, his childhood was short-lived. Parker had to grow up fast to become self-reliant, to help around the house and find work. "That wasn't uncommon back then," he said. "Kids as young as 8 or 9 were working side by side with adults. We didn't have much of a choice. Getting an education or waiting until we were older were just distant dreams." But fortunately, Parker was big for his age. By 10, he was taller and stronger than his 15-year-old friends. He was able to do manual labor, and having an extra hand around the house helped a lot. "I still remember my first paycheck," he said with a sad smile. "It was a small amount, but I was proud. My mother wanted me to spend it on myself, to buy something nice, but I didn't. I bought her a bag of flour to make bread, and used the cloth to make myself a new pair of pants." "I'm sorry," I muttered. "Yeah, me too." And the years went by, and Parker kept working, living his life day by day. Trouble was always close, but he faced it head-on. The adults were always trying to cheat him out of his wages, and the other kids were always trying to steal his meager earnings. "The first time it happened, I came home empty-handed, with a broken nose and a split lip," he said bitterly. "5 of them jumped me. It was a harsh world back then." When he turned 13, his mother brought a new man into the house. Parker had hoped for change, for a father figure, someone to look up to, someone to teach him how to be a man. "How wrong I was," he said. "That man was an alcoholic and an abuser. We found out quickly, my mother and I. She had bruises she tried to hide, and my stepfather was always drunk when I came home. When I came home again after being beaten up by the older kids, I was optimistic for the first time. I thought he'd go out and do something about it. But he didn't?" I asked hesitantly. "No, he beat me too for being a coward, as he put it. He said, 'This better not happen again, you hear me?' And he said the next time I came home empty-handed, he'd show me real hell." "Why didn't you run away or ask the authorities for help?" I asked. "Run where?" Parker replied. "The authorities didn't care." He kept enduring the abuse for his mother's sake. He couldn't leave her alone with his stepfather. And things escalated gradually. Soon, his stepfather started taking Parker's money directly, and then he'd beat his mother in front of everyone. "It didn't take long for him to start raising his hand at me regularly too," Parker said. "But that kept my mother safe, so I endured it. On the nights I was beaten, she was safe. And those nights became more frequent as time went on. At first, Parker was beaten when he intervened to save his mother, then he was beaten for not bringing home enough money, and then for no reason at all. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped, Parker admitted. Another kid stole my money again, and I was afraid to go home that night, afraid of what he'd do to me. So I ran into the woods, looking for a place to sleep. And instead I found an old well. An old well? I asked, unsure of its relevance to the story. Yes, an old well, Parker confirmed. You know, a hole in the ground to get drinking water. Yes, I know what a well is. Anyway, he found this old well, a crumbling thing that was no longer in use and in bad shape. Parker almost fell into it when he leaned over to peer inside. He tossed a small rock into it, but the rock didn't reach the bottom. Then he tried spitting into it and screaming downward. The echo lasted a long time, longer than it should have. Parker listened in awe as his voice bounced back from the well for several minutes, without fading. That gave me an idea. I didn't like what I heard. That night, Parker went home. He found his stepfather beating his mother because he wasn't there. And when he saw Parker, he chased him. Parker led him out of town and into the woods, away from civilization, deeper and deeper among the trees until he heard the faint echo of the well still calling to him. I hid near it and stayed quiet, he said. I waited until he found the well. He heard the echoes of my screams and thought I'd fallen in. That damn laugh filled the air. His stepfather approached the well and leaned over the edge, still laughing. Have you learned your lesson yet, you bastard? Parker mimicked his voice. But he didn't know I'd learned a lesson, just not the one he wanted me to learn. Parker burst from his hiding place while his stepfather was distracted and ran at him. All it took was one push, he said seriously. Just one push, and he fell into the abyss. He screamed all the way down. From that day on, his screams joined the echo of Parker's voice in the well. The authorities pretended to search for him for a few days, but no one really cared. He was just a drunk and a troublemaker, so everyone assumed he'd died somewhere or run off in search of a better life. No one suspected us, Parker said. Not my mother, who was too weak to fight, and not me, who they saw as just a kid. There was no way in their eyes that either of us could have killed a grown man. With his stepfather gone, Parker's life improved somewhat. He still earned little, and the other kids still picked on him, but at least he could rest at home. I went to that well every day at first, then every other day, then once a week at most. But the screaming never stopped. Day and night, their voices grew fainter, barely a whisper on the wind, but I could still hear them. Didn't it scare you? I asked. Of course it scared me, Parker admitted. But I also saw the possibilities. That answer frightened me. For a moment, I thought about asking Parker to stop, to end his confession and leave, but I was also curious, for better or worse. After that, it was the turn of the kids who bullied him. It took me a long time to gather the courage to even think about it, Parker said. But enough abuse can drive sane people to do insane things. The gang consisted of 5 members, their leader was 19, and the youngest was about Parker's age. The rest were in their mid-teens. Street kids hungry. Parker described them. Either orphans or with home lives similar to mine, which drove them to run away and face the world. But they were lazy, Parker said. They took the easy way out, stealing, scamming, and picking on other kids like they did to me. The community wasn't happy with them, but they didn't target adults, so they were tolerated. Until they beat Parker for the 100th time, and he decided enough was enough. I just wanted to get rid of their leader, he said. I thought their little group would fall apart without him. But I couldn't separate them. Parker tried to challenge him to a one-on-one fight outside town, but he showed up with the rest of the gang, and he was furious. You could see the murder in his eyes from a mile away. I knew they'd give me hell like I'd never experienced before, so I had no choice. All 5 of them had to disappear. Parker ran, and like his stepfather, they chased him into the woods. He hid near the well again, and when they approached to investigate the echoing sounds, Parker repeated his earlier trick. I pushed the biggest one first, he said coldly. Then, before the others could figure out what was happening, I pushed the second one too. The rest were smaller, and I could handle them. The others tried to run, but Parker caught up to them. I grabbed the smallest one first, tripped him from behind, and stomped on his knee until it broke, then moved on. The second one, I grabbed by the shoulders and slammed his head into a tree until his neck snapped. The last one, I jumped on him and got him in a chokehold. He was kicking his legs, trying to bite me, and when he realized he couldn't break free, he started begging, pleading for mercy, saying he wouldn't breathe a word about what happened here. He kept begging like that until we reached the edge of the well. The boy whose neck he'd snapped followed, and the one whose knee he'd broken dragged himself a long way before Parker caught up to him and finished him off. And their voices joined the well that night. Parker stopped telling the story for a moment and stared into space. At first, I thought he was giving me time to process what I'd heard, or that he was searching for words. I also looked outside and saw the shadow of a tree swaying in the starry sky, followed by a scream echoing. "We don't have much time, I need to hurry," Parker whispered. I was frozen beside him as he resumed the story, in shock and fear, not knowing what would happen or what I should do. I'd heard some confessions before, but none came close to what I'd heard from Parker. He'd confessed to 6 murders in 6 minutes, and I was sure there were more to come. The guilt ate me up inside, he admitted. I went to the well every day, fighting the urge to jump in myself. No one missed those kids, and no one in the community blamed Parker. He wasn't the only one being bullied, and in some ways, everyone was happy they were gone. One less problem in their lives. So, they were happy to pretend the 5 had run off to another place to commit bigger robberies. I was depressed for years because of it, but I told myself I had to do it, that my life was better now. Lies I half believed, but they got me out of bed in the morning. Another tree shook outside the window, but this time there was no scream. Parker visibly shuddered. Anyway, the years passed, and people started leaving the small town, heading to the big cities in search of work. I was one of them. I found a wonderful girl and left town with her. They took Parker's mother too, and found work at some factory. And for several years, I thought I'd left the small town and my horrific actions behind me, until I started hearing screams at night, voices I recognized. At first, I thought I was imagining them, and I tried to convince myself it was just guilt-driven madness. But they were real, Parker said. My mother disappeared one evening, and we never found her. The city police took it more seriously, but they found no evidence. No witnesses, no suspects, nothing. But Parker knew exactly where to find her, or what was left of her. After a long trip back to his old hometown and wandering through the woods, he confirmed his worst fears. My mother's voice joined the tortured choir in the well. I completely broke down at that moment, and cried alone in the woods all night. It was supposed to be me, not her. He went back home, but only for his girlfriend, who was about to become his wife. She was pregnant, and soon they'd have their first child. I wanted a better life for them than I'd had. I'd be there for my kids, for my wife, to make sure they'd be okay. They married in a simple ceremony, with few friends and even fewer family members. And our daughter was born a few months later, the most beautiful baby in the world. Parker said with a glint in his eye. Holding her, hearing her cry, was all I ever wanted. That was enough to justify everything I'd done and been through. Another tree shook outside the window, and something began to form in the bushes at the edge of the property. I screamed, and Parker reached out to grab my arm, holding me tightly as I tried to pull away. "We still have a few minutes," he said calmly. "And don't worry, it's not here for you. You're safe." He continued telling the rest of his story, and I had to try hard to divide my attention between him and whatever was out there. I was trembling every moment. I lived every moment with my wife and daughter, but you know how these things go. She grew up in the blink of an eye, before I even realized it. She said her first words, took her first steps, moments I couldn't be prouder of as a father. The beast began to make a guttural sound that shook my bones. A dying animal, was my first thought. A wolf being killed or a fox in mating season. It took a step forward, into the faint circle of light surrounding the nursing home, and I saw a human face, then another, twisted in pain and clustered together to form a massive head. Then that thing came back, Parker said, raising his hand to point at the advancing beast. More screams at night, more screams and whispers. I knew what it wanted, but I couldn't let it take me or my family. The beast took another step, and its neck and torso came into view. Its muscles pulsed randomly, its skin stretched taut as if pulled tight, and dozens of human arms protruded from it in random places. I knew I had to do something before it was too late, either get rid of it or appease it, and I knew what it wanted. What? I asked, confused and scared. People, bodies, victims, Parker answered. More of them. I'd whetted its appetite, and now it was hungry. If I didn't give it what it wanted, it would take them itself. I didn't want it to do that. I tried to convince myself not to do it until the last moment, but I was pressed for time and worried about my family, so I did it. I went back to town, he said. For a moment, I wished my eyes could do what the beast did. I wanted to turn and look at Parker to see his expression, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the beast. Every muscle in my body was tense, locking me in place. I could barely breathe. The beast took another step, and all those small, dead eyes focused on the window, on the room, on me and Parker. I kidnapped someone, Parker said, his voice breaking into a sob. An old man who lived alone. I knew him, knew he'd been a widower for decades. He knew me. He barely resisted as I tied him up and gagged him. I expected him to fight like the kids had, but the silence was worse. Did he know about that thing? I asked. No, of course not, Parker replied. He was just a weak old man, and he knew he couldn't do anything to stop me. Maybe he'd given up on life long ago, like me in the end. I wasn't sure. At night, I dragged him out of town and through the woods. I brought him to the well, said a short prayer for his soul, and then pushed him in. He fell without a sound. The beast stopped a few feet from the window and stretched its neck forward. At that point, I was almost useless, more of a prop than an active participant. Parker tried to stand up but failed twice. His old bones had lost all their strength, but I saw his determination. On the third try, he stood up, albeit a bit unsteadily. I went back to my wife and daughter after that, he said, taking a step toward the window. And everything was fine for a while. Seeing her smile, grow up, being by my side, that was enough to keep the guilt at bay. She was my world, and I was ready to do anything to keep my world from falling apart. The beast stretched one of its many arms toward the window, and the large and small hands began to reach through the air, trying to get to Parker. The next time the voices came back, I knew what I had to do. I knew how the rest of my life would be, what sins I'd have to commit. Every few years I'd go back to that cursed town, kidnap someone in the dead of night, and throw them into the well. The smile on the beast's front face widened, but the other faces weren't in sync. They began to whisper violently, their voices merging and growing louder. I kept doing that until my daughter grew up, until she found a young man she wanted to marry and moved in with him, until everyone left the town and it became an empty shell being reclaimed by nature. And I thought I'd done a good job. I thought my daughter was safe, and that I could finally let them take me, atone for all my sins. Parker closed the gap between himself and the window, and the beast did the same. It stretched its many arms into the room, the large and small hands reaching through the air, trying to get to him. And what happened to her? I asked. The question felt strange coming out of my mouth, as if it had been spoken by someone far away, completely detached from the situation. Parker stretched out one of his arms, but stopped and turned to face me. What do you think happened, Jessica? He asked sadly. What do you think drove me to run for the rest of my life and made me wary of getting close to people and making friends? I held back the answer, only because I had another question. Why did you tell me all this? Parker smiled, the same sly smile I'd grown used to from him. Because I'm a selfish old man, he said frankly. I wanted at least one person to know, and maybe miss me. Now you know. He took the final step that brought him within the beast's reach, and it grabbed his arm with 100 fingers. Thank you, Jessica, Parker said, his back to me. You can leave now. That would be best. I didn't argue with him. I slowly walked backward toward the door, my head heavy, my mind spinning, and my legs feeling like unsteady blocks of wood. But I did it. I reached the door, stepped out into the hallway, and closed the door quietly. Parker watched me the whole time, a calm smile on his lips, until I heard the lock click. The rest of the night was a blur. I wandered into the break room with tears streaming down my face, but I didn't even realize I was crying until I tried to light a cigarette and a tear fell on it. My hands were shaking like an earthquake, and so was the rest of my body. I smoked about half a pack as I waited and prayed for that thing to leave so I could leave too. After a few hours, I finally gathered the courage to quickly exit the nursing home and get to my car. I drove home in a fog, my eyes watching every little movement, and I couldn't sleep until dawn. But I returned to the nursing home for my next shift, looking like a ghost. The police were there, questioning everyone about Parker's disappearance, and I lied to them. I couldn't tell them the truth, not when I didn't even know where that cursed well was. So, I lied until they left me alone. I lied until they packed up their things, got in their car, and drove away. Everyone is so happy that Parker is gone, and I stand among them like a sore thumb, sitting in his chair, tossing and turning as sunset approaches. I realized he was right about both things. He was a selfish old man, and he left behind someone who would miss him.